Greetings of the day and welcome back to my channel. It is I, Brian Holdsworth, and I'm very pleased to offer this conversation that I got to have with Jonathan Pageau. He's somebody that I can honestly say I would enjoy sitting down with again, whether it's on a platform like this or just in private to have a drink with. He's somebody that was enjoyable to have a conversation with, and someone I felt like I could gain a lot more insight and understanding from. Like, it was frustrating because he had another appointment that he had to eventually go to, and so we were under this time crunch, and there was so much more I wanted to explore with him, and that is ironic and surprising to me because I was somewhat apprehensive to do this interview, even though a lot of people were saying you got to sit down with Jonathan, because I've had some exposure to his content and his publishing, and at times struggled to understand what it was that he was communicating. And I think that that's because he's operating at a level that I'm not. And so a lot of it goes over my head until I have the opportunity to actually ask for clarification. Like, what does that term mean? How are you using it? And how does it apply to the particular subject matter? And that's what was great about this conversation, is that I did have the opportunity to do that and to start to fill in some of those gaps for me where I wasn't keeping up. Jonathan's story was interesting to me because it reminds me a lot of certain aspects of my own story. We're both people who were drawn to the idea of art as something vocational for each of us, and there's something in art that inspires us to look for something more, some deeper meaning in life, and to try to communicate what that deeper meaning is. But both of us, raised in the postmodern milieu and even formed in that thought through the education system, came out the other end trying to apply this craft and this trade, and then discovering that there's a lot of emptiness in it after it's all said and done. But still being convinced that there is some sort of meaning that can be found there. But the way that we were formed in it just is kind of vacuous, and being disenchanted with that, literally disenchanted, if you take my meaning. And so we both went searching for that meaning again, and we both landed in traditions that have some appreciation for that. Him with Eastern Orthodoxy, and myself with Catholicism. Dostoevsky famously said that beauty will save the world. And that is often repeated among artistic types within the church, to the degree that it's kind of a platitude now. It sounds great, and I really want to believe that it's true. And sometimes when I listen to Jonathan speak, I start to get inspired to the degree that I think it might actually be true. What I like about Jonathan, simultaneously, is the same thing that causes me to struggle with him, is that I'm formed in this intellectual tradition that has a terminology and has a vernacular and has a system of thought that has worked well to build up what we came to know as Christendom and the intellectual tradition that is built up on that, but now struggles to penetrate the existing cultural context that we find ourselves in. And so it's almost like we need to find a new form of rhetoric that works. And there are different people that are doing that. And it seems to me that people like Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pageau are doing that to a certain degree. They're introducing something new. And for somebody like me, I'll struggle with the newness of that in the terminology because I don't know how it relates. But the more I spend time with them and their thought, the more I can appreciate how it does relate, and how people like Jonathan are bridging gaps to the contemporary culture to provide a new form or a new approach to evangelization and even apologetics. And so I'm excited to listen to him more, and maybe even get another opportunity to sit down and speak with him again. And I hope you gain something from this conversation as well. Before we jump in, just a quick word from the sponsor of this video, which is SaintMaker. And I want to add a little push to this in addition to the promo that you're about to see. This is an interesting product, and this is something that I struggle with. I'll often do my morning devotions and check out the liturgical calendar for the day, especially the sanctoral cycle, see who the patron saint is of the day. But I'm not often prepared in advance for these feasts. Because I don't plan it out and I don't sort of strategize and organize my life in a way that that I should. And I often struggle to find resources that will help me in that. Well, the Saint Maker is something that can help you get your life organized and help you work towards your goals, whether it be better liturgical living, better professional life, or just being more organized in general. So it's a really cool product. They've sent me the books themselves, and it's something worth looking into if you are looking for that. We all want to become saints. The truth is, many of us spend our lives running from distraction to distraction, and even for dedicated Catholics, our quest for sainthood often takes a backseat. The Saint Maker is the first high-performance planner for the spiritual life made by faithful Catholics for faithful Catholics. Combining the practices of Catholic tradition throughout time with the science of personal productivity, the Saint Maker will help you grow in virtue and structure your spiritual life while getting organized and achieving ambitious goals. And that can actually help you become a saint. Saint Maker is a beautiful, easy to carry, and well-crafted companion to your Missal, Bible, and Rosary. It's published 4 times a year, each season including daily planning pages, feast days, and devotions for both forms of the liturgical calendar, goal-setting pages, confessional journals, and a lot more. There are lots of great and influential Catholics using the Saint Maker, like Scott Williams, CEO of Sock Religious, best-selling author Sam Guzman, YouTubers like Dina Barco and Amber Schneider, and priests like Father Dean Marshall and Father Corey Sticka. So give it a try, and if you decide that it's not for you, you can send it back for a full refund within 90 days. Visit thesaintmaker.com to shop the planners. Quantities are limited, so head over to thesaintmaker.com to order yours and to start your Saint Maker journey today. So, Jonathan Pageau, thank you so much for agreeing to sit down with me today. I'm somewhat familiar with your thought. I've seen a few of your videos. I've heard a few of your lectures. I think I was introduced to you possibly through maybe some connection to Bishop Robert Barron or to Jordan Peterson, the way probably a lot of people are if they don't just happen across your YouTube channel. And I have to admit, I sometimes struggle to understand the thesis of your thought. I think a lot of it just goes over my head, and some of that might be in part because of the different traditions that we rely on for our thinking, and maybe we can get into that a little bit too. Sure. But I'm hoping that this conversation will be able to kind of come to that common ground and come to the table where we can really understand where the overlap is, and hopefully from me that I can learn a bit from what it is that you have to contribute. But before we get there, I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about your background, your history of thought. How is it that you came to believe the things that you believe now? Did you always believe these things, or has this been a development of thought for you and a progression? And if so, what were some of the contributions to getting you to where you are today?
So I grew up in a kind of strange way. That is, I'm from Quebec, which was, let's say, until the 1960s, the most Catholic place in the world, pretty much. Yeah. And then there was a massive shift in the 60s and 70s, especially, and there was a mass exodus from the Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. And among that exodus, some people left the church entirely, and some people became New Agers and all that kind of nonsense. But there are a few people that became Protestant. And my parents, because, let's say, the level of understanding of the clergy in Quebec, sadly, was not very high. It was like a kind of a folk religion. And so my parents, when they started reading the Bible, kind of encouraged by evangelicals, they had a lot of questions that weren't being answered by the clergy. And so they became Protestant. And for them, it was a real moment of authenticity and a moment of really embracing their faith and embracing God. So I grew up in that environment, basically a bunch of Catholics that had converted to becoming Baptist. My father was a minister until I was about 13 years old. And in my family, though, there was really an encouragement towards thinking, towards intellectual inquiry, and a lot of discussions in the family as well. And so when I arrived, I would say in my 20s, maybe a little bit before, like late teens, early 20s, things started to feel a bit wonky for me in my faith, being also, let's say, challenged by philosophy classes and
Mm.
university. I studied art in university, and so it was very postmodern. Even then, in the '90s, it was extremely postmodern.
Mm.
And so, at first reading postmodern philosophers, there was a lot of questions that kind of came up in my mind, um, and I just started feeling very unsatisfied with the way that Christianity was presented to me in the churches where I was, and this happened in collaboration with my brother Mathieu, who
Mm.
and so we started to read ancient authors, read texts from other traditions, like a lot of people read Buddhist texts, Gnostic texts, all this stuff,
Mm.
and discovering a different way of thinking, something like a transformational version of spirituality that you see in Buddhism and in a lot of the more Eastern faiths, and kind of surprised that we didn't have that in Christianity, and wondering, what's going on. Why is it in Christianity we just have this, like, you believe in Jesus and you're saved and you go to heaven? All of this, none of it made that much sense to us.
Mm.
And it's only with a bit of time and a bit of effort and prodding that we discovered, at least I discovered, especially the church fathers. My brother started studying mostly rabbinical texts. So we had these massive discussions, about kind of medieval rabbinical thinking, and then the church fathers. And that led me ultimately, also, I was going through a crisis in my own art, which was
Mm.
I was studying contemporary art, and I was a evangelical Christian. And so many conflicts. One was
Yeah.
making visual art as a evangelical, struggling to find theological grounding for that. Although there wasn't an overt hostility towards art, but there was an implicit kind of suspicion towards visual art, you could say, in the tradition I grew up in. And so I discovered ancient iconography,
Mm.
medieval imagery, and I really fell in love with the language. And I saw in the language a kind of universal, something like a sacred algebra. There was all these
Mm.
images that were referring to each other, and even using postmodern interpretation, intertextuality, and all that stuff, I was realizing that there was this powerful language, visual language in the church, and it ended up being related to the Bible itself. And my brother, reading rabbinical texts, was discovering these deep patterns in Scripture. And then I discovered St. Gregory of Nyssa, St. Maximus the Confessor, St. Ephrem the Syrian, and the early church fathers. And I realized, okay, it's not that this type of powerful transformational thinking wasn't there in Christianity, just wasn't there in the milieu that I was in, which
Mm.
ultimately led me to becoming Orthodox. And then with my brother, and in reading traditional texts and in studying iconography, we started to develop a way to talk about the patterns that were in the liturgy and scripture and in the iconography in a way that connected to, tried to connect to the contemporary world,
Mm.
tried to bridge, let's say, to the contemporary world. And then recently, I would say, in meeting Jordan Peterson, he kind of put me out into the public.
Mm.
And I also gained more language in terms of cognitive science, and even in terms of kind of, say, evolutionary biology. Though I'm not a big fan of evolution, but the patterns of evolutionary biology, the way they were described, was a good way to help people bridge, let's say, some of the gaps. And so since then, that's pretty much what I've been doing, is talking. I would say half of my public are atheists, really.
Mm.
Uh, and trying to help them see that in Scripture, there's a very deep, deep pattern. And it's not just in Scripture, it's in the liturgy and it's in the entire Christian tradition. And that this pattern is not just a moral pattern. It is, of course, a way to tell you how to live, but it ultimately describes something like the pattern of reality. That is, the manner in which we encounter the world is really the way that the first chapter of Genesis describes it, culminating in the story of Christ as something like the ultimate story. And so
Mm.
that's really, let's say, the world that I live in, the world that I talk to. And so I try to help people see patterns and help them see how these patterns are, in a certain manner, universal, and that they are frames through which we interpret reality or encounter reality. That's probably the best way to understand what I'm doing. So it's hard, like you said, it's hard sometimes to drop it to my videos because I can't make an introductory video every time. So
Right.
sometimes I try to make videos that are more general and try to talk about it in generally, and then some videos are very precise. And I kind of
Mm.
take for granted that the people watching those videos would have imbibed a little bit of what I'm talking about, so I don't have to start over at the beginning every time. So
Right. Do you have an introductory video that would be a good primer to the rest of your content?
Well, if you go to my channel, there's a list. We created a list. It's called "Start Here," something like that.
Okay.
What is
Okay, great.
symbolism, basically? And so, trying to help people see, trying to help people to see the Bible and the Christian faith and the liturgy a little differently. And when I
Right.
say differently, I really believe that it's closer to the ancient way that
Mm-hmm.
Christians thought about it or experienced it. And
Mm-hmm.
in the Reformation and in the Enlightenment, there was a twisting that happened at a point where we started to believe things were somewhat arbitrary. That the
Yeah.
world works through all these mechanical means, and then on top of that, we kind of have this story of someone who died on the cross to save us from our sins, which at some point I had so much sympathy for atheists because I could see how if you embrace the kind of mechanical, just a kind of physicalist way of understanding the world, and you try to superimpose a supernatural world on top of that, it always creates so many disjunctions in the mind.
Right.
But what I try to help people understand is that no, the Bible is actually describing the world itself, and
Mm.
our traditions are helping us participate in the world in the best way possible. So I always try to surprise people. I try to help people see that, for example, the pattern of Christ is a pattern that you can use to see everything, right? You can watch a movie and see and
Mm.
use Christ as a key to unlock the meanings in all narratives, pretty much.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. When you were encountering, so you came from this evangelical background like you described, and you alluded to the fact that something in the Reformation and then the Enlightenment distorted the tradition of thought that existed within the faith and within the church. Would you say that, like
It
my
starts
perception?
before that. It's before that. Like it
Okay,
starts. I think it really starts. I mean, I'm not the first person to say that. I think it starts in the late Middle Ages with nominalism,
right.
and that's really what starts the ball. You don't see the fruits of it yet at the beginning, but then the fruits
No.
start to appear at a point where you have these strange deformations.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Okay, so wow, there's so much we could unpack there. Before we get to the Middle Ages, let's keep the scope a little more recent. So
yeah,
talking Reformation and Enlightenment. Well, or actually, let's just narrow it to the Reformation for a second. My It's hard to talk to Protestants in a way, and this is fair, that where you group them and categorize them all as sort of this one thing called
yeah.
Protestant, right? I mean, obviously, you could say that certain things about Protestantism, you could criticize certain things about Protestantism, but as soon as you do, someone will say, well, that's not me. I'm this other particular branch, right? But it seems to me that there is a very, very strong current of fideism within everything that is descended from the Protestant Reformation. And by fideism, what I mean is that it's in a way of describing the faith alone doctrine of Luther, but it's not merely a way of talking about salvation. I mean, when I first encountered faith alone, I thought that meant that this is how we are saved. This is how we are justified. That's the Protestant sensibility on this. But Luther went a lot further, and he had a lot of things to say about scholasticism, which was sort of the system of thought that existed, that people like him were formed in up until that point. He had things to say about the tradition of reason within the church. So the ancient churches have this tradition of faith and reason sort of working together in harmony to help us understand both the knowledge that comes through revelation, but also the knowledge that comes through the natural law that sort of directs us and guides us towards what is true through our reason and our intellect, right? But Luther rejected that because of his sense that that human reason was fallible and corrupt through our sinful nature. Therefore, it couldn't be relied upon and should be discarded, especially when you consider the fact that we also have a knowledge that comes directly from the source of all that is good and true, which is God. Why would we even attempt to rely on our reason in contrast to that? So let's just discard reason and go with faith alone, go with revelation alone as our source and as our guide. But as you say, the problem that sort of erupts from that is that we have accomplished a lot through reason. The human ingenuity is something that is, you can almost marvel at it, right? And a lot of postmodern atheists, people that live in the postmodern age who are persuaded by atheism, look at the accomplishments of reason and say, why should I believe in the Bible when all of this great fruit over here has taken place as a result of technology and science and what have you? And furthermore, I have questions. You know, when you say these things from the Bible, or when you kind of recite these doctrines of Christianity, It seems to me that some of it's inconsistent, some of it's kind of superficial. So I've got questions, and the reply I often get is something like, "Well, because the Bible said so," or just church jargon,
Yeah.
kind of just thrown at you. Do you think that that's sort of a fair assessment of maybe the problem that exists within popular currents of Protestantism, and that they maybe need to recover some of this reason within the faith?
Well, I would say that you phrase it in a good way. The difficulty is that there's an arbitrariness to revelation when you start to see it that way. So
Okay.
you have this sense that there's this arbitrary revelation, and then we have human reason, and so we have to believe in this arbitrary revelation, and that's it. And it's like the whole idea of opposing faith to reason, all this stuff. I think that in a more traditional way of seeing the world, especially, my big. I base a lot of my thinking on St. Maximus the Confessor, which
Okay.
is that revelation is the source of reason. That is,
Hmm.
reason comes down from revelation, and I think that that's something also that, in a certain manner, is being understood in a strange way right now with things like cognitive science, which is that there has to be something given which comes before reason
Yes.
in order
Yeah.
for
Okay.
reason to
Hmm.
even operate. So you're
Right.
seeing it right now in the moral crisis and the meaning crisis, where for centuries now we've tried to reduce everything to reason, and now people are finding that they have no ground for their own morality. They have no ground for their any type of unitive
Yeah.
thing. Like, there's
Yeah.
no
Yeah.
ground for their organizations, no ground for their communions.
Right.
And it's because they don't have this normal hierarchy. So you could understand it like, something like the structure of the tabernacle itself, where in the holy of holies, in the secret place, there's a divine glory which is hidden.
Mm-hmm.
But that divine glory then operates through layers, manifesting itself in the world. And so that's the way that I think the best way to understand it. And you can understand it
Mm.
personally. That is, you have a capacity, you have a noetic capacity, a capacity to intuit the good, or intuit that which is beyond reason. And then from those intuitions, then will come down from that something like reasonable action or reasonable things. But you
Okay.
need that higher revelatory aspect of reality. And it's like everything kind of works that way. And
Hmm.
even science works that way, despite what people
Hmm.
think, because you need to know what's important before you study it. Right? There's certain things that we study and certain
Yes.
things that we
Yeah. Okay.
don't study. There's certain things we emphasize in the scientific endeavor, and certain things we don't emphasize.
Mm-hmm.
And those have to do with purposes that are beyond the rational, just the rational layout of the science itself within that category. And those stack up. They stack up, these goods, you could say, they
Hmm.
stack up all the way towards something which transcends everything. So I think that that's the problem, and it's the problem we're seeing in all the disciplines right now. Like, everything is kind of breaking down because
Mm.
they
Yeah.
have no way of articulating the reason why they're doing things. And in that is flooding
Okay.
in new religions and
Right.
these like new goods that are, like the kind of social justice emphasis we see in the world right now is kind of a religious
Yes. Right.
moment,
Right.
and it's a way to try to formulate the goods and then articulate things based on that. But it's twisted and it's deformed. But you can see it as a desire to heal the breakdown that we're seeing around us.
Right. Okay. So if we go back to like the Middle Ages or ancient thought, reason, like let's just move religion out to the side for a little bit. But reason was seen as something that you could apply to questions that are far more significant than just sort of the natural world, right? Sort of the material world. You could apply reason to questions of ethics, for example. You could apply it to questions of being and even knowledge itself. So these questions and this mode of inquiry that transcends just the mere material facts that are in front of you, that you can examine under a microscope, or you can point a telescope at, or you can mix together ingredients and see chemical reactions and that kind of thing. That there are deeper questions that reason can be applied to. But what happened in the Enlightenment And this is what's so ironic, and at least for me, very frustrating about the way that the Enlightenment is framed. It's framed as this expansion of knowledge and reason, when in fact, it's very much a contraction of reason. Because if that's the way that reason was applied in the past, or prior to the Enlightenment, and certainly prior to the Reformation, by the time we get up to the Enlightenment, we have thinkers like say Kant, who would say that, you know, there are limits to reason. You can't apply reason, can't tell us anything about ethics, about what is right and what is wrong, and how to conduct ourselves from within that. Something else he said is that contemplation is a useless, it has nothing to do with reason, right? So what you were sort of describing there, that there's a way that reason descends upon us and sort of stirs up our intellect and helps us and reveals something to us, right? My understanding of that, sort of in the Catholic context, is this distinction between ratio and intellectus. So intellectus would be sort of the contemplative mind, the mind that is more passive, in which information, it's sort of just like if you were to observe a beautiful landscape. You just sort of sit there and you contemplate it, you look at it, and you gain a kind of knowledge from that, for example, right? That truth can be revealed to us if we just sort of passively receive it. It's given to us gratuitously, right? Whereas ratio is the kind of reason in which it's laborious. It's where we apply our ability, our ability to understand things and analyze things and gather data and draw conclusions from that. Whereas Kant, and he was obviously one of the more vocal voices of the Enlightenment, said that intellectus is, we have no use for that. Everything that is of a reasonable nature, anything that can be applied to reason, is about work and labor, the intellectual work, or the application of gathering data and analyzing it and interpreting it and making sense of it. So very much a sort of a science-only approach to reason, kind of setting aside philosophy in huge strides. And since so much of what we used to apply reason to, especially when we think of like the humanities, those kinds of disciplines, they've now kind of become divorced from reason, the same way that the faith had become divorced from reason in the Reformation. And now that maybe that helps to explain why so many of the disciplines within the humanities are so unhinged from reason. It's just assertions of certain things that aren't necessarily, you can't have an argument or a discussion of a rational nature about it. It's just, you know, whoever can scream or yell the most dogmatically kind of wins the day.
Yeah, definitely. I think that for me, the best model, there are several versions of it in scripture where you can see it happening. So you understand, let's say Moses, the ascent of Moses, the ascent of the mountain, especially the way that St. Gregory of Nyssa describes it, is probably the best way to understand it. Yep. You know, Moses ascends the mountain and ascends it ascetically, right? Ascends it through contemplation. Okay. He removes the sandals, he removes the garments, he strips away the people and the elders and all the quantity, and moves up into that invisible place, that place of revelation. And then he receives the revelation. He receives the pattern of the tabernacle. He receives the pattern of everything, basically. Especially St. Gregory of Nyssa describes it that way. It's like, it's basically Christ that he sees at the top of the mountain. And then when he descends the mountain, he comes down with the law. Right. Now, the law is the working out of the revelation. It's the making explicit the implicit nature of the revelation. And so it's something like reason. It's like applying to all the different aspects of reality that which is contained in the secret place, or in the heart, or, you know, in a space which is beyond duality, you could say. You know, when Moses goes up the mountain, he's basically going back into the Garden of Eden. He's going into the Garden of Eden, to the place where God comes down and encounters the earth. Okay. And so that's really the way that I see it. The law, or the working out, the reasonable working out, comes from a given. So this might seem very abstract, but it's absolutely very, very practical, which is that once you have the purpose of anything, then you can work out reasonably the things you need to do to get to that purpose. But within the system, reason will not give you the purpose. The way that a car is built will not tell you that the reason for the car is for you to go to the store and buy milk. That's the reason. Those are the reasons why we use cars, and they're
Mm-hmm.
not contained in the let's say the layout, the mechanical layout of how the car is set up, or the reasonable way in which it's set up.
Okay.
And it's the same for anything you do. Like you have a reason to do something, and then the steps are more like the reasonable part. But the reason is given outside of the system that you're using to do it. And that's the same. It's the same with science. Science is the same. Like the reason why people are studying how to split the atom has nothing to do with splitting the atom. It has to do with
Okay.
making a bomb. It
Mm.
has to do with creating energy for to make us live. Like the reasons why we do things are always beyond the system that they give. Like the steps we get to lay them out. So it's like a basics. What I'm describing is like a basic structure of reality.
Yeah. So, in the way that we conduct ourselves in our lives, what is it that you think informs most people or gives reason for the things that they think and then the things that they do as informed by what they think? Because on the one hand, you could say that, well, we should contemplate the purpose for why we do things, and then rely on some sort of ethical framework to lead us and guide us within that, either through our reason or through something like revelation or a code of ethics that comes down to us through our ancestry. Or maybe I could just be motivated by what I want to do, something that propels me based on my instincts or my passions or
Yeah.
maybe my culture around me. How would you describe sort of the context that we are in these days? Do you think that there's some sort of, is it not a clear distinction? Are the waters very muddy in terms of what motivates most people?
I think definitely there isn't. So in a traditional world, in the ancient world, there was a hierarchy of goods, and
Yeah.
this hierarchy of goods was not at all arbitrary, because it basically led all the way up to the transcendentals of God, like the
Mm.
transcendental nature of God, and the idea of good, truth, beauty. These things are the real reasons why we do things, and we can get distracted. The way to understand is that we have all these secondary desires, or these secondary goods that we engage with,
Yeah.
and these secondary goods, they can trap us, right? They can
Yeah.
confuse us, because they usually are goods. Like eating is a good. We have a purpose to eat. It's one of our purposes, and
Okay.
that purpose is a good purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And so we move towards that purpose in love, right? We actually have a desire to find rest in eating, and that's not bad. It's a
Mm-hmm.
good thing. The
Okay.
problem is that the way that the contemporary world is set up, it's almost inverted. It's almost flipped upside down. Where in a traditional world, especially in the traditional Christian world, you would have this hierarchy of goods, which would lead you up towards virtue, which would lead you up towards love, which would lead you up towards freedom
Mm.
from these things on the side. But
Yeah.
now what we have is the opposite, is that all our idiosyncratic desires are seen as identities. That is, like, I have a desire for that, and I identify with that desire so fully that I can't
Right.
break away from it. It becomes
Right.
becomes an idol. It really is a form of the contemporary world is really a forms of idolatry,
Hmm.
where we confuse all these things that we want, whether it is accumulating goods, whether it is our own
Mm.
kind of sexual desires, whether it is whatever it is, even our jobs, all this stuff. It's upside down from what let's say the Christian world had set up, and
Yeah.
it, in a way, it became inevitable that this would happen. You could have, I mean, I'm sure you can find predictions of it, right, in the late Middle Ages,
Certainly.
where
Yeah.
where the idea is, like, if you give up the highest goods, then you're going to end up with, like, porn, furry, like people buying insane things. Like, all of this was going to happen because the if you keep your eyes down in the world and you just focus on phenomena and you just focus on the lower things, it's going to come with that as well. It's a kind of
Yeah. Yeah. So, where did the shift take place, or what do you think is the cause of the shift in this thinking, going from the ancient world to the contemporary world?
well, part of it is definitely, there's something in nominalism which is very strong, which is,
Mm.
it's actually, I tend to see the entire progress of the modern world as something like a de-incarnation. And so
Okay.
you so you have, for example, Occam. One of the things that Occam does, that Occam wants to put God very so high. He wants to make God
Mm.
so transcendent that God becomes arbitrary.
Right.
And so there's no connection out of the desire to preserve the transcendence of God. There's no connection with the will of God and the layout of how the world actually flows. And
Mm.
so it's like God's will is just this arbitrary thing that, and God ends up being something like an arbitrary being up there that
Yeah.
created us and now intrudes in our world once in a while, let's say. And so you can see this like de-incarnation
Yeah.
to a point where it's funny because we tend to think of the modern world as just materialism, but it's not. It actually, after the kind of break, you could say, even in during the time of the Reformation, you see a kind of spiritualism come about, and so you see it happen with secret societies, Freemasons and Rosicrucians, and you
Hmm.
have these characters like like Jacob Boehme and all these kind of weird esoteric figures. And
Yeah.
then you have the fideism that you talked about down
Yeah.
here, this kind of popular faith and scientific rationalism. But there's
Right.
a weird connection between the two. Like Descartes
Mm.
spent his whole life trying to become a Rosicrucian. And people
Mm.
forget that there was this weird break. And so you had this kind of spiritual world up here, and then you had this kind of material world down here, and they just weren't connected anymore.
So you're talking about the esoteric order, the Rosicrucian? Is that how
Yeah,
you say it?
yeah.
Okay. Oh, I thought you were talking about something else. I didn't realize that. I didn't know that about Descartes.
That he wrote these like public letters to the Rosicrucian order in the hopes that he would be initiated in their thing. But
Hmm.
it's just an image of what happened, which is this kind of break where
Right.
you have, and you see it today. Like someone says something like, "I'm spiritual but not religious."
Right.
That's a perfect image of that because they view spirituality as something which is floating above
Right.
and isn't connected to the communion that I engage with, isn't connected to practices that I engage with others. It's like a
Yeah.
purely
It's like a
idiosyncratic.
it's like a dualism between your material life and some other remote thing that
Yeah, so
you
you
can
can live
access when
how
you
you
want
want, you
to.
can do whatever you want, and
Yeah.
you have your spirituality that floats above it. And it's a powerful image of the de-incarnation, which happened. Whereas if you read the ancient fathers, like especially if you read the Dionysian tradition, and you look even still in Aquinas, you find it,
Mm.
and in Saint Maximus, there's a sense in which God is both fully transcendent but also fully immanent, and that God
Yes.
permeates the world. That hidden behind all phenomena, you can find a divine spark, that there's something animating it to make it exist, you could say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want to tie this back to what you were hinting at with idolatry, because to me it seems that whatever we place as our highest good, and this is something that you were alluding to as well, becomes for us, for all intents and purposes, God. Right. So if I'm a theist or I'm a Christian, then my highest good that I recognize is in fact God, or at least some conceptualization, some theology around what that means. And I try as much as possible to relate to that God. But one of the things that I will immediately recognize if I'm a Christian is that God, that highest good, is something that is far surpassing anything that I can understand and any power that I can possibly wield, right? So I am subject to that God. I am contingent upon the benevolence of that God. I am nothing before it. I am bankrupt before that God. So there's a humbling effect, but there's also a sense in which we submit to that highest good rather than try to control that highest good or manipulate that highest good. And you even see that to some degree in perhaps pagan cultic practices, in which it's not so much that they are submitting to the gods, depending on which tradition you're drawing from, as much as they're trying to persuade the gods, right? Give me some benefit, give me some favor, some fortune that I'm trying to access, and therefore I will devote myself to you, and I will make sacrifices to you, and I will humiliate myself before you to some degree. Whereas,
But you're totally right, and that's we do it still all the time now,
right,
right? That
right,
all the things we engage with, we end up sacrificing to these purposes that we have,
right,
and people don't realize that they end up acting very much as gods. A lot of these,
right.
the world of paganism is flooding back in all kinds of very
Mm,
strange and surprising ways.
mm-hmm,
But that ends up being a side effect of the rejection of Christianity, because the
mm,
formulation of Trinitarian theology is is not arbitrary. It is a revelation, but it's not arbitrary, right? The
no,
world does exist through love. The world is for the world to exist, it has to be a balance between unity and multiplicity. Like these things are all the manner in which the world actually exists. God is the infinite source and version of that, where he's both fully one, fully three at the same time without contradiction.
Okay.
And so, but it actually, the description of theological descriptions are not arbitrary.
No.
They really do underlie our experience and the way we exist in the world.
Right, and they had to go through the spin cycle of intellectual and rational scrutiny of the tradition of reason that existed at that time. I mean, the reason that they were so caught up in all of these debates about the Trinity and Christology and the divine nature of Jesus and all of the questions that surround that is because the revelation of Jerusalem collided with the reason of Athens, and the Athenians were looking at that and saying, well, how does this make sense, and then how does this work, and what's the mechanics of that? And the church fathers had to say, well, we have to come up with some answers here, because these are compelling questions, and that's how essentially we get theology, which is this synthesis of revelation applied, like our reason trying to understand the revelation, essentially. Now,
but the idea, like if you see in the First Council, it's usually mostly preserving the incarnation, trying to preserve the incarnation in a manner that will not create confusion and not create the problem of either putting too much importance on the human level and the human part, and then also not separating the human and the divine so much that there's no connection between the higher world and the lower world, like the world of principalities and the world that exists. And the Christianity it's just interesting. It's interesting to notice how Christianity is incarnational, but the fathers seem to have understood that almost in the revelation of the incarnation, there was a danger that if you get it wrong, it can lead to all kinds of distortions in the way we live our lives. And we can almost see, like you can see in the modern world, how it is in a way getting the incarnation wrong, and how it starts to manifest itself in all kinds of deformations.
Yeah, it's amazing how none of the novel ideas that we think are so forward thinking, I mean, everything under the sun had been conceived even prior to the incarnation. Like you look at the Greeks, and they had nihilists, they had naturalists, they had pessimists, they had theists, they had all the range of things that you would see in our modern relativist culture. They had already been talking about 2,000 years ago, and we tend to think of that as sort of Bronze Age superstition. But in fact, we haven't broken any new ground that wasn't broken thousands of years ago. And I think
it's super. But it's really, what you're saying is super important, and I think that we're in an interesting moment right now, because there are some thinkers that, although very scientifically minded, like I'm thinking of people like E. McGilchrist and like people like Jordan Peterson and others in that vein, who are realizing. A person I talk to a lot is John Vervaeke. He's a professor at the University of Toronto in cognitive science, and realizing, okay, the Greeks, what they were talking about, like Plato or Aristotle, they were actually talking about reality. They're talking about the way in which we engage it. And as we come to the end of this kind of scientific materialism, and people are realizing that there's a limit to what we can actually describe and understand, these frames are appearing, like the higher frames, you could say, the idea of purposes of things, the inevitability of identity, for example. So a good way to formulate it that I use all the time is that everything is both one and multiple at the same time. Everything you can encounter.
Unpack that for me, because I don't know what you mean by that.
Right. So a chair is one thing.
Yes.
Right. It's a chair, but a chair is also many things. Right. It's legs and it's a back, and those legs are also many things.
So it's composed of many things.
Of wood. It's made of of paint. It's made of all these different identities, and so identities stack up. And so everything you encounter is both one and multiple. Now, the way in which things are one is a complete mystery to the modern scientist. It's a given. Like, why do I think that a chair is one thing? What makes it one thing?
Okay.
Because it's a bunch of things.
Yep.
And it's a bunch of things. And it scales all the way down to like quantum fields or whatever.
Okay.
Right? And so this is the problem now, that as science kind of reaches its limit, they're really realizing the problem of identity, the problem of they use words like emergence and all these kinds of words to try to talk about the manner in which multiple things jump up into unity.
Yeah.
Right. And so that once this happens, like even in the scientific world, once they realize the problem of unity and multiplicity coexisting, they realize that, that's what Plato was talking about. That's what Aristotle was talking about. And that's what Aquinas was talking about.
Exactly.
They were talking
Right.
about it thousands of years ago. And the weird scientific age is like a strange parenthesis where people stopped realizing the problem and just started looking at all the details and didn't realize that they're not accounting for the manner in which things coalesce into unities.
Right. That
things have names, that things have identities, right? And that this is related to something like consciousness or something like intelligence.
Okay. So how do you start to answer some of these questions? Like, do you just look back at it and say, well, it's a mystery, or it's a starting point, or it's an axiom, or can you unpack that a little bit more, drawing more from ancient thought, where maybe a contemporary thinker would be ignorant?
No, it's not. It's not difficult at all. It's not difficult because it can help. It actually can help people understand religion so much better, right? And so you have, at the outset of Scripture, you have a description. There's heaven and there's earth, and even in the Middle Ages, you read someone like Dante, and he completely linked it with Aristotle and said, heaven is the place of actuality, and earth is the place of potentiality. So you have names, you have identities, you have principles, and then you have potentials in which those principles can exist. And so a chair has an identity, and we know, and it's a purpose, right? It's not just a general identity. It's like a chair is for sitting.
Yeah,
that's what it's for. And so that's
so
what
it's final cause.
Exactly. Yeah. The final cause will, let's say, legislate what can participate, how it gathers unity together.
Okay.
So it's harder. It's easier to see in terms of human interactions, obviously. So a sports team is a great way to understand it.
Okay.
It's like you have a team, you have a bunch of people, and those people can change, right?
Yeah.
They can actually change. They don't have to be the same people, but there's something joining them together. There's a purpose joining them together, and that purpose is the unitive principle which makes the team exist.
Okay.
Right, and that purpose is to play basketball or whatever.
Yeah.
And to play within a hierarchy of different teams that play together.
Yeah.
And so the players are potential. They're potentials in which the identity of the team can gather together and create unity.
Okay.
And so it's the same with everything that exists between one and multiple has that reality.
So you would say that this potential for a purpose kind of scales up to everything in life, and eventually leads to what? God? Is that where it goes?
Yeah, well, it ultimately leads to God. There's a jump at some point, obviously.
Yeah.
It's like God is beyond all description. Definitely, that's necessary. But it definitely scales up in a way that. The reason why I emphasize this so much is that one of the problems people have today is that they think that religion is arbitrary and superstitious,
right,
and that it doesn't make sense.
It's why would I made up, and
why would I go to a building and stand there and then sing songs and eat bread and wine? Like, what is this? All this nonsense? Like, what is going on? And so, what I try to help people understand is that reality is the reality that you participate in church. Is a reality you participate in every single human interaction that you have. That is like let's say you sit together for a family meal, right? That family meal is the thing that's binding you together, and then there's a ritual in which you participate in order for that to exist.
Yeah.
But you can't do anything at the table. There's certain things you can do, and there's certain things you can't do. Like if you stand on the table during dinner, you're going to ruin dinner.
Okay, yeah.
Right. If you lay down on the floor during dinner, if you scream at each other during dinner, you're going to ruin dinner.
Yeah.
So there's this ritual. There's this pattern. This is a good way to understand it. There's a pattern of being that makes a family dinner exist.
That makes it what it is? Is that what you're saying?
That's what it is. Yeah.
Okay.
It's this the joining of multiples into one. And those multiples are not arbitrary. They're like a dance. They're like a pattern. They're like a
Okay.
They really are like a breathing in and breathing out, you could say.
Okay.
And so, you sit together, you eat the same meal, you talk to each other. Everybody has to listen to each other. It's a liturgical thing,
Sure.
a
Sure.
family dinner.
Yeah, and I can appreciate the significance of that as someone who lives a liturgical tradition and understands what that word means, but for somebody who is on the outside of that looking in, how do you underscore the significance of it for them? Like, what if for them, they might just say, well, that's just customs. That's just cultural habits to make us all feel comfortable and welcome. It could just as easily be that the best thing to do at a dinner party is to stand on the table and do something crazy. If our customs were so constructed in a different way.
But that's, I mean, it's nonsense, because there is a reality. Like if I said standing on the dinner table, then maybe that could exist in some culture, but like taking a dump on the dinner table is not going to exist.
Okay.
There's a limit. Like, there's flexibility in the potential, right? There's always flexibility, but there is a manner in which that flexibility starts to break down on the edges. You can't have anything, right? If you encounter someone and you have a conversation, that conversation is ritualized, and you will talk to them.
Sure.
If you spit in their face, then you're breaking the communion. And these things, these patterns are inevitable. But it doesn't mean that there's only one way to do it. There could be flexibility, but that flexibility, just like a chair can be made out of a lot of things.
Sure.
But a chair can be made out of water. You can't make a chair out of water. It's just not possible.
Right.
There's a manner in which potentiality is bound to an identity.
Okay.
In a certain pattern that holds it together for a certain way.
Yeah.
And so let's bring it back to a religious ritual, for example.
Okay.
Is that so? Our rituals scale up. So we have small rituals, like, you brush your teeth. You have to brush your teeth in a certain way. You can't brush your teeth in any way. If you brush your teeth with a razor blade, then you're going to be in trouble, right? So you have to brush your teeth in a certain manner. There's flexibility, but there's a reality to that. And that is for a certain good. And then you have families, you have communities that have ritualized encounters for a good that is maybe a little higher. And church is that, but for the highest good. We gather together, right? And we attend and we celebrate the highest good, the God of infinite love.
Yeah.
And so we come together. First of all, we recognize that good, and then we act together in a way that makes us attend and makes us, let's say, connect together towards that highest good.
Yeah.
And this is something, like I said, that happens in a soccer team. We do the same. We do that in a soccer team. It's just that the soccer team isn't attuned to the highest good. It's attuned to a lower good, which is, it's fine to win a soccer team, but you can't base all of human civilization on soccer.
Right.
You need higher goods, and that's where religion inevitably becomes a part of any real civilization, because you have to find a way to identify, join together in that good, and recognize and celebrate that good.
So the community at large has to recognize some purpose of their own unity that brings them all together,
or else they're not a community,
right?
Or else they're a crowd. Or else they're suburbs. And the suburbs are a great example of a breakdown of that process.
Okay.
Because, if you think of an ancient town, you would have a town with, like, usually the church is somewhere in the middle, or maybe in the east, like it's in a prominent place,
or a monastery or something.
The church spire is higher than all the buildings.
Yeah.
And so the town exists, and they all can look up and see the thing which binds them together. Right. They can all see it at the same time. And then on Sundays, they go there and they do the same things at the same time to recognize the good which is binding them.
Okay.
And then lower than that, you'll have like a civic building, maybe a market, places of communion, which we recognize, but have to be submitted to that higher good.
Yeah.
Because if the civic authorities aren't submitted to the God of infinite love, they're going to become corrupt, and they do become corrupt. They become obsessed with economy. They become obsessed with trade. They become obsessed with power over people. And then you scale that down. Now the suburbs is a great example, because they said, no, we don't need the churches, right? The churches in the structure of the way the city
or a
is.
city center even necessarily.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
well, once you remove the church as the center, then you have this. At first, you have the civic building, but at some point, it's going to break apart. You're going to remove that. Then
Yeah.
you're going to have the mall. The
Right.
mall is going to be the last remainder of like unity in cities. Then you get rid of the malls, and now you just have individual points spread out on land where
Yeah.
there's no connection. You don't know
Yeah.
your neighbor. You
Yeah.
don't have any common projects, and that is an inevitable consequence of breaking down, of getting rid of the higher identities or the higher meanings that we participate in.
So again, if I'm a skeptical person, I can say, yes, okay, so I recognize that there needs to be some sort of unitive principle in all of these various settings that we might describe, and that if we want to scale it up to something like a community or a society or a civilization or a culture, there still needs to be something as that center of gravity. But I don't believe in God. I don't think that that's real, and that just seems like an arbitrary attempt to try to fill that void with something. How do we reply to somebody like that who says it could just as easily be humanity itself that we recognize as this great sort of supplement for replacement for divinity as the thing that we're all, or social justice or something like that?
Well, that's for sure what people are trying to do.
Okay.
They're
And
trying to
why doesn't that work?
Well, it does. Let's say the social justice part.
Yeah.
I can explain why that. Every reason it does it. Like every reason has its the reason why it doesn't work is in its own. It's in its own thing.
Okay.
But for example, one of the things that Christianity created, because one of the problems with this system,
Yeah.
let's say the system of identification, is that all identity excludes. That is inevitable. Right.
Yep.
That's what an identity is. Part of identity is.
I get that. Can you unpack that a little bit though for people that are listening? Why does it? What do you mean? Why does it exclude?
Well, because for something to exist, it has to not be the things that it's not.
Okay.
That's quite simple in terms of that. So
Yep.
For example, think of a team, right?
Yep.
So a team has a purpose. A soccer team.
Yep.
A soccer team has a purpose, which is to be really good at soccer, and they're
Right.
going to play soccer. And
Yep.
so the potential of that team will be based on its purpose.
Okay.
So they're going to want to have the best players.
Right.
And so because they want to have the best players, they will definitely exclude people from the team.
Yep.
That'll be inevitable.
Yep. Okay.
Now, one of the problems with the social justice system is that they realize this with reason. They're right that identity excludes, and it's a problem. But their solution to the problem is to make inclusion the only vector by which we exist.
Right.
But that doesn't work.
Yeah.
Because the purpose of playing basketball is to win basketball games. If you make the purpose of basketball game team inclusion, basketball will actually cease to exist.
Right.
And I'm not joking. It'll take a while.
Yes.
At some point, it will actually cease to exist.
Yeah.
And this is the difficulty with the social justice mentality, is that it's trying we can give them the benefit of the doubt with good reason to make inclusion the main reason for all things.
Yeah.
But it actually is destroying society. It's destroying the world.
So whatever that center of gravity, that unifying principle is, it has to be something that actually does produce the unity that we want. And assessing what will produce that unity might be, I mean, that's difficult to really ascertain. But we do have a history behind us that we can look back upon and say, well, for at least 1,000 years, society went from a Roman Empire that crumbled to all this sort of disparate leveling of the field, where a lot of chaos reigned, but something within that became the unifying principle of all of these communities that emerged, and eventually a civilization that surpassed even the greatness of the Roman Empire. And I don't think people appreciate how great the Roman Empire was. I mean, if you go back and look, one of the things I really love that some people are doing now on YouTube is these 3D renderings of the city of Rome, if you've ever seen these, of what it actually looked like at its height. And it is a supernatural thing to believe that people with no mechanized technology like we have today could build something like this, right? Like and not just something that is so sophisticated and has accounts for the provisions of necessity, but is also so beautiful at the same time, right? It's one thing to build a building because we need a place to all gather, or a civic center. It's another to build a beautiful building when you don't have cranes, you don't have backhoes, you don't have electricity, you don't have any of these things. It's almost a supernatural feat for them to have built that. And the medieval society surpassed the Romans. How did they manage to do that? Well, they had this unifying principle that brought pretty much all of Europe together for a time, where they could work together. And that's not to say that there wasn't conflict.
Of course,
But
it's not a perfect system.
yeah,
But this is the solution that Christianity offered is the cross. That's the solution that the Christianity offered, which is that how do you deal with the problem of exclusion? How do you deal with the problem of marginalization?
Yeah.
And the answer is the cross. That is, Christ went to the edge of the world. Christ went into death, right? Christ reached out to the margins and made the highest point of the hierarchy, you could say, of a unity as self-sacrificial, which is something which was not there in Rome.
No.
Like, that wasn't there in Rome.
No.
The idea that the idea that the leader or the top of the hierarchy
is a servant,
is there to love those that
right.
that are below him.
Yeah.
And obviously, like you said, it's not as if it happened all the time, but
No.
it did become the ideal.
But it was supposed to. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And the notion that this is the way to solve the problem
Right.
of identity, which is to make the summit of identity self-sacrifice and a giving back, a giving down to those that are below you, and a giving down in love. Like when St. Paul talks about these hierarchies, when he talks about the idea of the husband and the wife, he really frames it that way. That is that
Yes.
that we have a sense in which we are meant to serve those that are even, let's say, are the king or the authority, but there's a deal there, which is that king is supposed to love you and care for you
in a self-sacrificial way.
Really and so what the difficulty that happens with social justice is that they understand the problem of exclusion, but the solution they give, which is, first of all, this weird, like, absolute inclusivity, this leveling of hierarchy, but not just leveling of hierarchy, and actually upside down hierarchy, where the most marginalized and the most excluded becomes the king, by default, and that doesn't work.
No.
It creates new systems of scapegoating and new systems of exclusion, which are kind of like which are weirdly upside down.
Yeah, and it's fairly obvious that we're seeing that now. I don't know how that couldn't be obvious to anybody who's paying attention to anything that's going on in the contemporary world. So let me ask you this then. So, given this disparity between so much of the good that came from ancient and medieval society, and the way that we thought of things and the way that we organized ourselves in society, to what's going on today, how do we now speak into contemporary society in a way that is productive and will actually lead towards more unity, certainly in society? Is there potential for that still, or would you say that's a hopeless cause?
I think we can awaken people to the inevitability of the Christian story, and that's something that I talk about a lot, which is that most of the time, it's an interesting phenomena that's happening, for example, is that as Christianity gets evacuated from the public sphere, it actually starts to appear in these strange, like, dim lights all around you.
It starts to resurrect.
Yeah, which is that every single, like, high budget movie that's made now is basically the story of Christ in a weird kind of deformed way, but nonetheless it's there, right? It's always about self-sacrifice and death and resurrection. And so you and the manner in which people criticize, let's say, Christianity, takes for granted certain things like compassion, like love for the stranger, love for the marginal, which is a Christian virtue. So I'm trying to help people see that the story of Christianity after Christ is inevitable. Even the neo-pagans, like, you look at the neo-pagans, and very few of them will really take up a kind of martial neo-pagan attitude where you should just slaughter your enemies and you should just take bounty from everybody around you. You should rape and pillage. Like, nobody, very few, but some people might. But they're definitely not making a lot of waves, let's say.
No.
So I think that's been the way that I've been trying to help people see it, is that these patterns are inevitable, and the patterns of unity and multiplicity are just part of reality. They imbibe our social structures, they imbibe our social rituals, and they are totally infused by what Christ brought. And it would be best for us, like, as people, to at some point, like, just recognize that, and then to ultimately re-embrace the best version of that, because there are fragmentary versions of it, and there are broken down versions of it. But if you can see it, then all of a sudden you're like, okay, well, maybe I need to pay attention to this Jesus figure again, because I
Okay.
just thought it was just silly and nonsense. But as for a social society in general, I think that we can build an arc. Maybe this is the best way to understand it, but I don't see. I see darker days ahead. Let's say for a
Yeah.
little while.
Okay. Okay.
Well,
I can
it's
appreciate that.
also it's how can I say this? It's like there's something also about Christ which is very fascinating, which is that Christ seems to include his own death in his story. It sounds silly to say that because yeah, obviously he died and he knew he was going to die, but
Right.
he also chose his betrayer, and in the story of Christianity there is the notion of Antichrist, which is there right at the outset, that part of the story of Christianity is Antichrist, and that there's the mystery in the manner in which Antichrist will manifest
Mm.
itself.
Mm-hmm.
And that mystery is something like it'll bring about the New Jerusalem. I don't know how. Like I don't know how it's going to bring about the heavenly Jerusalem, but there seems to be a playing out of a pattern, which is
Mm.
that as Christianity evacuates and as it
Mm-hmm.
dies, you could
Yeah.
say,
Yeah.
it's nonetheless filling up the world in a very mysterious and surprising way.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah.
That could be
Interesting.
the little hope that we can hold on to, you know.
Well, certainly, as if you really do believe in the promises of Christ, we know that He will be with us to the end of the age, right? And if it is the end of the age, well, then great. You know that's the end of Antichrist or whatever might be an alternative to Christendom or Christianity or the church or God Himself. But certainly, as dark as the days may get, we can be confident that He is still overcome. I want to shift gears here a little bit and talk to you about art, because obviously you are an artist
Hmm.
and you've studied in let's say postmodern art by the sounds of it. Do you have sort of a definition of art, like, and maybe even a criteria of what defines good art, or is that far too ambitious?
No,
A
it's
figure for
not
you?
at all. I don't
Okay.
think it is. But my let's say my approach is quite radical. It's not radical. It's very traditional actually, but it's radical to modern ears,
Right.
which is that the idea that art has value in itself is just nonsense. Art doesn't have value in itself. You know, the ancient
Like
way of understanding.
like art for art's sake, you mean?
Yeah, like
Yeah.
the
Okay.
idea that you would have to fight over what art is, who cares? Like that doesn't matter. That is the ancient way of understanding art. Like even the word art means fitly joined, well joined together, things that
Okay.
are well joined together.
Hmm.
And so we need to understand that more profoundly. The idea of poiesis or techne, even the notion of gathering disparate things into unities. That's what art is,
Hmm.
right? It's a capacity to bring things together into one. And so there's an art. So the ancient way of thinking of it was that there are arts. The art is the way in which you do that. So there's an art of poetry, and there's an art of cheese making, and there's an art of carpentry, and there's an art, and the arts are focused on purposes.
Yeah.
That is, the purpose is what's driving the art. So if you're making a chair, there's an art to making a chair so that it is a proper chair.
Hmm.
And so once you start to see it that way, then things change radically in the way you think.
Is there a
Which is that
distinction? Sorry, is there a distinction between arts and crafts, though?
I don't see any
No. Hey.
distinction between
Okay.
arts and craft at
Hmm.
all, because this is the problem which happened, which is that the notion of contemporary art, the way we understand modern art, let's say, as just these things that we look at, for example,
Yeah.
like the idea that you make an object for people to look at that has no purpose in the world except for you to look at.
Is that all it is,
It,
though? I mean, I get that contemporary art would certainly affirm that, but perhaps maybe the fine art of the early modern period, or even up to sort of classical art of the classical period. So, like a painting, you could say that it doesn't have a purpose the way a chair or a building has a purpose to be used, but it does communicate something that is edifying or good for the soul, wouldn't you say?
so I would say that the highest form of art is participative art. That is really the highest art.
Okay.
It is, and the highest art actually is liturgical art. Like that is the highest art,
Mm,
because it is art in the service of the highest purpose.
yes.
It is art which is celebrating the source of all reality.
Okay.
And then from that you can have secondary arts, let's say, and you can even have entertainment. Like I have nothing
Right.
against entertainment,
Right.
but the problem with the kind of modern definition of art is that we think that entertainment is at the same level as, so for example, like the highest types of dancing would be something like folk dancing, actually, where you come together and you dance together and you manifest the unity and multiplicity in a group through these
Okay.
patterns of movement.
Yep.
It's not ballet.
Okay.
Like, ballet is fine. There's nothing wrong with ballet,
Hmm.
but there's something about ballet which is already once removed from its purpose as a way to manifest communion.
Hmm.
And so it's the same with paintings. Like a painting that is, for example, a painting that is put in a church, a painting of Christ, or
Mm-hmm.
a painting that is there to celebrate a family, like a portrait of a family.
Yeah.
There are these types of visual arts that can participate in the world in a real, like, objective way.
Hmm.
But the difficulty is that the move that happened, let's say in the Renaissance, not a little bit in the Renaissance, but started to accelerate, let's say, into Romanticism,
Yeah.
was ultimately going to lead to postmodern art. There was actually no way around it, because you've divorced art from participation. And so it becomes idiosyncratic already at the outset. And so it's going to lead to more and more idiosyncrasy as you move forward. And it's the same with so much of let's say passive art, the type of art that you just watch.
Yeah.
Whether it's opera, whether it's all that stuff. Not like, I don't want to say that all of this is nonsense, that none of this has meaning,
Transparent,
but
yeah.
there's a manner in which there's a difference, for example, between let's say a bunch of Greek warriors that listen to a retelling of the Iliad.
Yeah.
Right? They're hearing their story.
Hmm.
And
Right.
they're listening to their story is a deeply participative act,
Hmm.
you know.
Mm-hmm.
And because they know it and it's sung and they will know some of it,
And
they'll
there are
sing with
lessons
it.
to be learned, and yeah.
But as soon as you remove that and you move into fiction, you're already losing a lot in terms of participation.
So like
So
Renaissance or early
there's
modern.
nothing wrong with that. Like,
Yeah.
I make that type of art too. Like, I make icons for churches,
Right.
but I just published a graphic novel, which is a totally fictionalized work there for entertainment. But the
Okay.
difficulty is that we need to be able to put things in their proper
Hierarchy.
hierarchy of place, because or else we end up with like people who binge, like the idea of like the idea that binging Netflix would be a cultural thing.
Because it's something we all do on our own, in our own little bubbles, not in a participatory or not. It certainly doesn't provide that unitive function that something truly cultural would, I suppose.
And you can see it kind of degrading as it moves. And so, for example, like let's say the ancient liturgical year was the main mode of participation of a society. And so they would have festivals, and they would have banners, and they would have specific costumes for different times of the year, and different dances and different types of music for different types of the year, where they would all kind of participate in this grand symphony. And so as it degrades, you could say that it can still be better at higher levels. So going to the theater together and sitting there in a crowd and watching a movie together is degraded from that, but it's better than sitting at home and watching 9 hours of a Netflix series alone with your, with your junk food and your it's like, so there's levels of this, right? It's a hierarchy, basically.
Yeah. So would you say that that's the essential quality of true culture, is that it is unitive and participatory? These things that we think as being cultural. So let's use art as the example, or dance or music, and those kinds of fixtures of culture. If they are to be part of an authentic culture, they do provide that participatory and unitive aspect to it. Whereas pop culture doesn't do that. Pop culture, contemporary culture, is more like a cafeteria where we're each doing our own little thing. It doesn't provide anything where we're participating in something together, unless we all happen to be at a concert together. But even then, it's just us as individuals kind of embracing our identity, kind of grounded in the type of music we like or something like that. Is that a fair assessment?
No, that's exactly right. And it's so you can see it, you can really see it playing out, and as it devolves, let's say, and becomes more and more idiosyncratic, you can see it happening. And it, the ultimate version is, the weird, and there are perversions of that, because people aren't satisfied with that. People aren't satisfied with just entertainment culture, and so they try to make it
More
religion.
significant. Yeah.
That's why
Right.
they have cosplay, and that's why they
Right.
become obsessed with Star Wars and dress up to go see movies, because they're longing for participation.
For
And
true
I get it,
liturgy.
because
Yeah.
that's what we want, right? That's what we want. But let's say going to church and celebrating a saint that died in the Roman Colosseum and whose relics are there, and you can venerate the relics, is
Yeah.
different from putting on your Jedi outfit and going to the movies,
Yeah.
because one of them is deeply related to your one is deeply related to your identity,
Yeah.
deeply related to your history, and the other one is kind of an idiosyncratic fiction that
Right.
you can't live in.
Right.
You can't be a Jedi. Like, I'm
Yeah.
sorry if some people think they are. Like,
Yeah.
you just can't. You can't be a Jedi.
No.
But you can be a saint. You can definitely be a saint.
Right. Yeah, that's a beautiful insight that we, in the absence of aiming our culture towards something that is true and leads to our own our true fulfillment, to some higher good, we take these things that are kind of more superficial and try to give them the significance that otherwise would exist if we were living a more liturgical or cult as in culture-based life, right? Where we were actually worshiping something that can be a proper object of our worship. I think that's a beautiful insight.
But I think it's available for people today. I think that many people that are not at all Christian or not all religious can follow you on that path and understand the problem, understand the problem in which we are. Not only understand it, but notice the desire to create new forms of participation, new sacraments of inclusion and of exclusion. Right. This is radically important right now, because there is a desire to create a sacrament of inclusion and exclusion that's happening right now. And it is ultimately a religious thing. The fervor with which people are acting is a religious fervor.
Yeah. And as a Catholic, this is something that is very frustrating for me, because we do have a rich history of culture, of liturgy, of art, of sacred music that have all been used to create this unity, to create this sense of identity. And that is the point of inclusion, right? Where we are all drawn to something of such significance and beauty. But yet in an attempt to try to interact with the modern world, we've said, let's downplay all of that. Let's sort of level it off and get rid of the ornamentation that exists there. And let's try to make concessions to the outside supposed culture, or the sensibilities of the pop culture that exists around us. And then maybe they will be drawn in. And obviously that's not happening. No, certainly.
I mean, it works for a while. It works a little bit for a while, but it ends up, because you can't compete.
No, you can't.
Rock stars.
Exactly.
You can try, but it doesn't work.
That's right. Okay. I want to shift into a bit of a conversation about sort of ecumenism, the Catholicism and orthodoxy. What I guess I want to get your sense of. Obviously, you've encountered Catholicism along your intellectual journey. You've been exposed to some Catholic thought. What led you towards orthodoxy as opposed to Catholicism?
Yeah. Well, in my case, it was really that I was leaving the evangelical church, and the Catholicism I was encountering was basically going the other way.
Right.
It's like, you're coming this way, and I'm leaving this thing. So why would I go into your thing if you're moving in this direction?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a weird self-hatred in Catholicism, and there's a strange kind of shame about their own tradition and a desire to dismiss it and to kind of push it aside. And I think that also, although it might have been possible to find some strains of Catholicism or some groups that are more mystically oriented and kind of have read the early church fathers and really live in that world, I don't think it just wasn't readily available. Whereas, let's say when I read St. Gregory of Nyssa and I read St. Maximus the Confessor and I read the early church fathers, going into an Orthodox church, you realize people live in those worlds. Like St. Gregory of Nyssa is completely real to Orthodox Christians. These thinkers, this way of seeing the world, this kind of integrative, mystical way of seeing the world is the life of the Orthodox Church. And then also the iconography. I really fell in love with medieval art, and at first I was sad because I thought it's not available anymore.
Right.
This powerful language that the Church kind of universally developed in the first 1,000 years of its existence.
Yeah.
It just was gone.
Yeah.
But within the Orthodox tradition, it had been
There's a remnant
almost lost, but ultimately preserved. And so it's all those things.
Okay. What do you make of ecumenism and movements to try to bring about unity within the different Christian denominations and schools of thought and persuasions? Do you think that that's worth working towards, or do you think that that's counterproductive?
Of course, it's worth working towards, but I would say it has to be authentic. I think that ecumenism, the way it's framed now, is difficult because there seems to be a desire to just say, come together just like this. But I do think that the desire for the church to be united is wonderful, but it has to be worked out authentically. It has to be worked out in terms of theology. It has to be worked out in terms of working out the difficulties that appeared in the church, working out the difficulties of authority. I think these things have to be worked out. And I feel like a lot of the ecumenism right now is mostly is kind of social and political, and it's not
right.
It doesn't seem very theological. It's like, let's just show that we all love each other and we're together, which we can love each other, but we also have to recognize the reality of the schisms that have happened.
Certainly. Yeah. Maybe if I can put an exclamation point on this question and see if you have any thoughts on this, but as one of the people who, like, I'm a convert to Catholicism. I didn't really have an encounter with Orthodoxy the way that you did, but maybe early on, if I had, that would have been a strong pull on my radar. But as somebody who has an appreciation for the full scope of certainly culture and the theology and the intellectual tradition going all the way back through the Middle Ages to the ancient world and to the Church Fathers, trying to find my fit in the Catholic Church, which the Catholic Church does to a degree offer that, right? It's in embracing the modern world, there has become a bit of a cafeteria Catholicism that people operate within. And so I've found sort of a community and people in a liturgy that does work for me. But I often feel like at times, as a Catholic, we're trying to promote that view, but we're missing a huge part of the organ or the muscle that we need to do that. And in many respects, I would say, well, that's the Eastern lung that we're missing there, right? And so on one hand, I feel like we need you guys. We need you guys to come in and to help be that voice. Like, there's so many councils that I think that we were missing so much of the Eastern voice that could have been there, that could have better shaped the outcomes of where we've gone as a church. And I wonder what you think of that, if there's any potential for that kind of thing, or if that's persuasive to people within the Eastern Orthodox tradition.
I mean, I think that for now, I don't see it as, how can I say this? I think that for now, it's fine also to be across the aisles and to help each other the way we can. I love Catholics and I love Protestants too. And I think that there are seeds in Catholicism and there are seeds in even in Protestantism that are ripe for burgeoning and that can kind of burgeon into powerful things. But first of all, it's not my role to kind of actually work through the difficulties.
Right.
So at least for now, I think that it's, I mean, that's it. I'm sad to say, like something like in the eschaton, maybe. Like I see it as something that there's something inevitable about the way that things have happened, let's say. And so, so I don't know. I'm probably not answering the way you would want me to, but I don't totally see it.
The answer I want, Jonathan, is for you to say, you're right, I'm going to become Catholic today, and I'm going to lend my voice to the struggles that exist.
Yeah,
right
that's
now.
not going to happen,
Okay.
especially not in Quebec like the way it is. But I mean, I love talking to Catholics, and I think that, I love talking to Catholics, and I think that there's beauty and power in the tradition. And even like I have no problem with integrating Western medieval imagery and Western medieval things into my own Orthodox world. Like I think the Gothic is a very, very powerful, very, very powerful thing that is purely Western, right, and has a strength to it,
and purely Christian too. I mean, it's one of those exclusively Christian cultural items that emerge from Christendom that isn't really borrowed from anywhere else.
So yeah, but I'm not going to become Catholic. Sorry.
Okay. Well, we'll have to have a part two to see where I
Sure,
can.
sure.
Okay.
Definitely.
Well, I really appreciate the conversation, Jonathan. That was in fact a lot more interesting than I expected it to be, because I feel like we did kind of hit the ground running there and
Cool.
find some common ground. So maybe we can do it another time. I would really look forward to that.
Sure. Anytime. I'd be happy to. It was
Okay,
nice to talk to you.
Yeah, you too. Thanks a lot, Jonathan.
Right.
Thanks for watching. The reason I can continue making content like this is because of the generous support of my viewers. If you feel called to support this work, then consider joining the Reinforcements, which is my online community. There are multiple tiers, including free access for those who can't help financially but still want to join. You can join up at www.brianholdsworth.ca. Certain levels will also get a free gift basket from Glory and Shine, who is a family-owned Catholic bath and body products company whose beard balm I'm wearing right now. It's like aromatherapy for your face. Even if you don't join, they make amazing products, so check them out at gloryandshine.com. And don't forget to like and subscribe. You don't have to agree with everything I said to get value out of these kinds of conversations, so be sure to subscribe to be edified or challenged. There's value in both.